Have you ever thought about prophecies hidden in plain sight? Well, today we're diving into William Hanna Thomson's book, The Great Argument, and his idea is pretty wild. He claims that inside the Psalms, these ancient Hebrew poems, there are incredibly detailed predictions about a coming Messiah. It's a bold claim, so let's get right into it.
I mean, really think about it. Can a song actually predict the future? We're talking about poems written thousands of years ago, supposedly foretelling specific historical events. Well, that's exactly what Thomson argues. He believes some of the most famous lyrics ever written were basically a blueprint for a life that hadn't even been lived yet. So, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the whole idea of prophecy in the Psalms. Then, we'll dig into the 4 key Psalms Thomson uses as his evidence: Psalm 2, Psalm 22, Psalm 45, and Psalm 110. You'll see how each one adds another layer to this incredible picture he's painting. Okay, so here's the main idea from Thomson. He's not saying every psalm is a prophecy. He gets that, a lot of them are about King David's life, his struggles, his triumphs. But he says there are these other psalms where the language just goes off the charts. It's so specific, so grand that it just doesn't fit David's life. Thomson's argument is that these can only be talking about one person, the Messiah.
All right, let's look at the first piece of evidence. This is Psalm 2. On the surface, it's about a king in Jerusalem, but when you look closer, this is no ordinary king. We're talking about someone with absolute worldwide power. Let's see what the text actually says. Okay, did you catch that? The scale here is just massive. The king is called God's son, and his inheritance, not just the next town over. We're talking the uttermost parts of the earth. That's huge. So you got to ask, right? Is this just fancy poetry about a regular king like David, or is something else going on? Well, Thomson's answer is a hard no. For one, the psalm talks about kings of the earth rebelling. That's a global conflict, way bigger than the local tribal disputes David ever faced. And even more telling are the titles: Messiah, Son of God. Thomson says these are used with a kind of divine authority that no regular human king in Israel would ever have. The scope is global, the authority is divine. It all points to a totally different kind of king.
Okay, now we get to what Thomson sees as his most powerful piece of evidence. And it's a big shift in tone. We're moving from a triumphant king to a sufferer. Psalm 22 isn't a victory song. It's a raw, incredibly detailed description of suffering that feels like it was written for another time entirely.
Yeah, those words probably sound pretty familiar, right? What's just stunning is the detail. They pierced my hands and my feet. Think about that. This was written hundreds of years before the Romans even started using crucifixion as a common form of execution. For Thomson, that incredible specificity is everything. And when you put it side by side with the Gospels, it's just uncanny. You've got the crowds mocking him, check. The piercing of his hands and feet, check. The soldiers dividing up his clothes, check. And then they even gamble for his tunic, check. Thomson's point is, these aren't just vague similarities. It's like a point-for-point checklist that matches the crucifixion of Jesus perfectly. But here's the real kicker. The psalm doesn't end with this guy dying. There's a twist. It says that because of this incredible suffering, all the ends of the world will turn back to God. So you have this one specific brutal death leading to a massive worldwide religious movement. I mean, that's a perfect description of the historical impact of Christianity, isn't it? Okay, for our third piece of evidence, we're going somewhere you might not expect. A wedding song. Yep, Psalm 45 is basically a song for a royal wedding. But right in the middle of all the celebration, the writer says something to the king that, according to Thomson, would have been totally shocking, absolutely unthinkable in ancient Israel. There it is, plain as day. The psalmist looks at the king and says, "Thy throne, O God, is forever and ever." He straight up calls the king God. And you have to understand the culture here. This was a strictly monotheistic society. There was one God, and you were not him. The line between God and man was absolute. So to call a human king God, Thomson says that's not just poetic flair, that's potential blasphemy. He argues the language is meant to be shocking, to make you realize, wait a minute, we're not talking about a regular king here. This has to be someone who is both king and divine. All right, our last example is Psalm 110, and this one introduces a figure who is, impossible.
At least, impossible under the old Hebrew law. It describes a ruler who holds two jobs at the same time, king and high priest, which was a huge no-no. So you get two pretty radical statements in this psalm. First, God says to this figure, who David calls my Lord, "Sit here at my right hand." That's the ultimate seat of power. And then second, God declares that this same person is a priest forever. But not just any priest. He's from this completely different ancient order of a guy named Melchizedek. Now, here's why that's such a big deal. Under Jewish law, kings could not be priests, period. If a king even tried to act like a priest, it was a disaster. So, for a psalm to predict a figure who is both a conquering king and an eternal priest, that's pointing to a whole new system, a new kind of ruler. And of course, that idea of a priest-king is absolutely central to how the New Testament describes Jesus. Okay, so let's take a step back and look at the big picture. This is where Thomson's great argument really comes together. It's not about any single one of these psalms in isolation. It's about what happens when you lay them all out together. You see how these four different portraits start to merge into one person? From Psalm 2, you get the universal Son King. From Psalm 22, you get the sufferer whose death actually saves people. Psalm 45 gives you the divine king who is literally called God. And Psalm 110 gives you the eternal priest king. Thomson's whole point is that these aren't just random, unrelated poems. They're like puzzle pieces that fit together perfectly to describe one single incredible figure. And that's really the core of it. Thomson is saying that this pattern, a ruler who is a divine son, a redeeming sufferer, God in the flesh, and an eternal priest, it's just too consistent and too specific to be an accident. It's not just poetry. It's not a coincidence. It's a prophecy woven through the Psalms.